Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan. Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks. The admission's free.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
delicious.
mental?
Open your mouth. OK, here comes a train.
Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa!
Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox,
That's right, we want to hear from you,
GB News.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my two comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Wake up to the headlines with Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Good evening, it's me, Camilla Tominey, with tonight's Farage. Do not adjust your set. I'm obviously not Nigel, who's a bit under the weather after his trip to Iowa in minus 20 degrees conditions. So I'm stepping in for him tonight, and on tonight's show we're going to be discussing, of course, Channel migrants. Would you believe that 16,000 people who have arrived here illegally by boat have been allowed to work? Seemingly not quite the deterrent that the government planned for. We'll also, of course, be talking about Storm Isha, floods, horrendous rain, one death of a man aged 84. We'll be discussing whether climate change might be to blame. And as Ron DeSantis pulls out of the presidential race, we'll be joined by a pollster who's going to give us his update on what Trump's chances are of winning back the White House. But first, here's the news with Polly Middlehurst.
Thanks very much, Camilla. Well, good evening to you. The top story from the GB Newsroom tonight. New weather warnings have been issued with the new storm Jocelyn heading for the UK just as the country recovers from Storm Isha. 2 people died and tens of thousands have been left without power after the UK was battered with high winds last night. Gusts of more than 100 miles an hour and heavy rain caused major travel disruption with flooding and fallen trees, while planes were diverted and trains were cancelled. ScotRail has announced it's again suspending services from 7 o'clock tomorrow as the new weather pattern approaches. There'll be no trains on Wednesday, they say. Either lines are being checked for damage. Downing Street denies the government's pursuing an anti-BBC agenda after announcing a raft of reforms as part of a review into the corporation. Under new plans, Ofcom could gain more powers over BBC News website articles if it doesn't meet relevant standards. Government recommendations imply Ofcom should be given increased oversight over the BBC's online services, including its YouTube channel. The Prime Minister says BBC News is not immune to scrutiny. And British farmers are calling on MPs to support tougher regulations to protect them from what they're calling unfair treatment by the so-called Big Six supermarkets. A dozen scarecrows were placed outside Parliament today as MPs debated reforms to the grocery supply chain. That's after 110,000 people signed a petition urging the government to overhaul the grocery supply chain's code of practice. Riverford Organic, the company which started the petition, said the scarecrows represented farmers they claim could go out of business in the next 12 months, blaming the buying practices of the supermarket Big Six. Labour's accused the government of turning a blind eye to what it's calling corruption after new data showed water bosses are pocketing millions despite overseeing illegal sewage spills into our rivers. Figures show water chiefs have received more than £10 million in bonuses and nearly £15 million in incentives since the last general election in 2019. It's also received just over £621,000 in benefits. And Queen Camilla has toured a domestic violence refuge in Swindon today to celebrate the service's 50th anniversary. Her Majesty met with staff, volunteers and families at Swindon Domestic Abuse Support Service. During her visit, Queen Camilla told a well-wisher the King is fine as he prepared to undergo treatment for an enlarged prostate this week. King Charles is saying he wants to be more open about his condition to encourage other men to get themselves checked out. That's the news on GB News, across the UK on TV, in your car, on digital radio and on your smart speaker. This is Britain's News Channel.
Thank you very much, Queen Polly. Now, let's get into this story about Channel migrants being allowed to work. It was broken by my colleague Charles Hymas on The Telegraph on Saturday. As you can imagine, it's created a little bit of a stir because on one hand, we've got the government pushing through this Rwanda bill, which it says it's doing to be a deterrent to people who are paying criminal gangs thousands of pounds to come here by barely inflatable dinghy. Now, as you'll probably be aware, there's a huge backlog in asylum processing. So some people who have been here for more than 12 months have been allowed to work. Now, that to me, I think is counterintuitive, because if you're saying to people, if you come here illegally by boat and you have to wait for up to 12 months for your asylum claim to be processed, but actually don't worry because after that year we'll bring you into the workforce anyway, isn't that just acting as the opposite of a deterrent? Isn't that saying to people, you come across here because there's a chance of you working? It also kind of defies the logic, doesn't it, of an asylum claim? Because arguably, if you're then seeking work after that 12-month period, you are in effect an economic migrant, not necessarily an asylum seeker. So that's where the story is now. We had a lot of response to it by our readers. I mean, one particular reader who said, look, I'm a 58-year-old white working class guy. My wife works in care. We've worked hard all of our lives. We feel that the government is treating people who come here illegally in a worse way than it treats its own. You know, it puts people up in hotels and then it says at the end of the year that you can have a job. We found this information out, by the way, through a Freedom of Information request, so it's not as if the Home Office would have necessarily been forthcoming with this information in the first place. And in a moment, I'll ask you what you think about it, but let's just look at what the Home Office said. A spokesman gave us a statement and they said, in 2010, the government restricted asylum seekers' rights to work so that individuals who have had an asylum claim outstanding for more than a year can only apply for jobs on the shortage occupations list, and once employed may have their taxpayer support withdrawn. OK, so the question is then, do you think that these asylum seekers should be able to work if they're waiting that long? Wouldn't it be better to put them into the labour force, not least when we do have a shortage of certain sorts of workers? Or actually, is this the opposite of a deterrent? Does it just attract more people to come here? Is it giving people who come here illegally, particularly, you know, risking life and limb on the channel, a sort of licence to come here if they end up with a job at the end of it? Do email me. It's farage@gbnews.com or tweet #Farage on GB News. Let's bring our guest into the conversation to see what she thinks. Madeleine Sumption is the director of the Migration Observatory at the University of Oxford. She certainly knows her onions when it comes to all matters migration-related. Lovely to see you, Madeleine. Thanks so much for joining me this evening. You can see this debate from both sides, can't you? Because on one hand, I feel that this does fly in the face of what the government's tried to achieve with its Rwanda bill. It's trying to say to people, do not come here illegally. And there's a legitimate argument, isn't there, to say that if you are a legitimate asylum seeker, then come as an asylum seeker legally rather than illegally and make an application to work here.
Yeah, I think what the challenge for the government basically is that there are two groups of people who apply for asylum. The people who are going to get refugee status, at least under the current rules, and the people who won't. Now, if people are not going to get refugee status, the government, once they get refused, the government's going to want to remove them, and it doesn't necessarily want to be giving those people work rights. For the other group, though, for people who are going to get refugee status in the UK, you actually do want to give them work rights because there's a lot of evidence that basically if you keep people out of the labour market for a long period, then it's much harder for them to support themselves once they get refugee status. Now, of course, the solution to all of this is not to take a couple of years to make people's claims, right? If we were making decisions in 3 to 6 months, none of this would really be a problem because people wouldn't have to wait very long out of the labour market if they are going to be given refugee status in the UK.
What's your interpretation of the events going on in the Home Office that it is taking this long to process people? I mean, I read that back in the day it took about 5 months to process, but on average, and that many applications didn't last longer than 6 months. We're now in a situation where many asylum seekers are here for months in hotels at taxpayers' expense, seemingly with no outcome to their case. How's that happened?
That's absolutely right. I mean, this is something that's built up over a long time. And I should say that processing has actually really sped up and the government processed many more applications last year than they had in the previous years. I think effectively what happened was two things. So we had a gradual increase initially and then a quite sharp increase in the number of people applying for asylum, particularly sort of from 2022 onwards. But the number of cases being processed didn't increase. And in fact, it actually fell. There was a period, 2018, 1920, when the numbers were going down. And so the problem built up for a long time. And the problem is once you have a backlog, it's quite difficult to dig yourself out because you've got to keep on top of the new cases that are coming in, as well as trying to work through the cases of people who've been waiting, in some cases, 1, 2, sometimes even 3 years.
Also, what's your interpretation, if I'm reminded again of these figures? I mean, I do find it staggering to have a look at those small boat crossing numbers and be reminded of the fact that only in 2018, I mean, it's not that long ago, we had 299 small boat crossings across the Channel. Obviously, we have that figure in our mind from 2022, which is the highest number of 45,774. Why do you think we had that jump between 18 and 22? Was there a Brexit factor? Was it to do with the fact that there was this notion that actually those who were coming across the Channel would be given a hotel, room and board in the UK? What do you think, Madeleine? How's it exploded in this way?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not clear exactly why it happened at precisely that moment in time. Part of the issue, I think, was that the government was actually quite successful in clamping down on people crossing in lorries at the, getting on lorries at the freight terminals in northern France. And so then people started looking for another route. I think, to be honest, part of what's happened is just people realised that it was a possibility. I think that the Channel had always been seen as much more of a barrier than it was. And once an industry grew up around it, once a few people started to do it successfully, then of course you have more organised groups and smugglers getting in on the action and helping to facilitate it. And I think it's one of these things where the genie is out of the bottle in a way that once people realise this is something they could do, it's actually been incredibly difficult for the government to find ways of addressing it.
I mean, the makeup of migrants these days, some have suggested that what the government did with that agreement with Albania and said, look, you're a safe country, so you shouldn't be seeking asylum here at all, should be extended to other countries like, for instance, India. I mean, would that bring the numbers down? Are we seeing a lot of people who are coming from safe countries seeking asylum, which to some people seems rather oxymoronic?
So the government, as you say, it has a deal with Albania, which is probably one of the reasons the number of Albanians went down. Although, actually, to be honest, I suspect that it wasn't just because of what the government did. They've also said that they want to designate India and Georgia as safe countries. I don't think that will have a huge impact on the numbers because actually the challenge with the government is that most people coming across the Channel are from places like Afghanistan. That's been persistently one of the top countries, Iran, Iraq, places where actually a lot of the asylum claims do end up getting accepted. So these are people that the government ultimately says do qualify for refugee status, and the government has accepted that they don't want to send Afghans back to Afghanistan, for example, which sort of really narrows the options of what they can do, because if they don't want to give people status in the UK, they have to find another country that's willing to take them. Now, that's where obviously the Rwanda deal comes in, but there aren't that many countries who are willing to take refugees from the UK. Yeah. Many are dealing with more refugees than the UK is receiving anyway.
Do you think the Rwanda plan will work finally?
Well, let's assume that if it goes ahead and flights do start leaving to Rwanda, I think there's a huge uncertainty about whether it will actually create the deterrent effect that the government hopes it will. We don't really know. I think it depends to a large extent how many people actually end up going there. But I think it's very possible. I think there's no guarantee that it will work. I think it's possible that if the numbers are small, the deterrent effect will also be quite small.
Madeleine Sumption from the Migration Observatory, thank you very much for your time this evening. Mike Pagnam has been listening to that. He's chair of the Independent Care Group. Mike, lovely to see you as well this evening. Now, obviously, the argument on behalf of asylum seekers who are waiting to be processed to work is that sectors like yours, the care sector, needs these workers. We don't have enough homegrown people filling these jobs, and therefore it only makes sense to put people who would otherwise be languishing in hotels paid for by the taxpayer, put them into the system, have them earning and therefore paying tax.
Yes, I can see from your previous contributor there's a lot of conflicts in this policy, and it wouldn't be the first time when government policies contradict each other. What I can say is that we've got a massive shortage of care staff in this country, 152,000. We need people from overseas. Now, we also want people from overseas that want to work in social care, not because it's something that's there for them because that's the only option, because it's a very highly skilled job. So we need to make sure that people we bring in really want to be there and are caring. And I think that by 2035, just to give you an idea, we need nearly 400,000 extra care staff. So we've a long way to go. The problem is the government has not addressed the social care challenge, which is why we're in this position with overseas workers at the minute.
Well, they've certainly dragged their feet, haven't they? I mean, how many times have we been promised a social care sort of policy platform, and it's not ever been delivered? When it comes to care workers...
Too many times.
Too many times, Mike.
Yes.
I was going to ask you, I don't know whether you've got these figures to hand, but what proportion of our care sector workers are from overseas, even if it's approximate?
Well, I think the last count was that around about 70,000 of those came over into social care. So it's helped a bit, but we've still a long way to go. And as you know, the government is looking at making it more difficult, not being able to bring dependents across. And that's a big factor too, is how we can expect people to travel halfway around the world and leave their loved ones behind them. It's a caring industry. So that's put a block on it. But the government has no answer. If we can't get staff in this country to work in social care and we can't have staff from overseas, what do we do? Because remember, the social care and the NHS work together. So the waiting lists go up.
But why can't we get people in this country to work in social care? Why do you think that kids who are leaving school, maybe leaving university, not least because healthcare work now, it's become professionalised, people have got ever greater needs, there's new medicines to help people, and we know we've got an ageing population. So as you say, that 400,000, I mean, that might be a conservative estimate because people over 65 are now, outweighing people who are under 20. So why can't we get kind of homegrown talent to go into this industry?
It's very frustrating. I think we'd take up your whole programme to go into everything, but basically and briefly, it's a generational issue. Sadly, in this country, social care, it's that word social, has a negative impact. And I believe it starts at school, really, is encouraging people. Social care is a great option to go into, has a career structure. The challenge, of course, is it's not the most highly paid job. What we're calling for is parity on NHS pay into social care, because at the minute, many people in social care are only just above the national living wage.
And are some care homes threatened with closure because they simply can't get the staff, Mike?
Yes, yeah, that's definite. We've lost more beds in this country in the last year than ever before, but we need more in the future. Yes, people want to be cared for at home. Yes, people want to live in extra care housing, but there's still a need for care homes, particularly nursing homes. So do play a vital part. But as you probably know, figures produced just the end of last year, there were 13,000 people in the NHS waiting to be discharged into social care and couldn't move because there was no social care package. So it's a very difficult challenge. And this government and others, I might just say, it's Labour as well, have never tackled the social care challenge.
Mike, if you could wave a magic wand, what's the first policy that you would introduce? Just imagine that you could become Prime Minister, particularly in this issue. What would really move the dial here?
I think making social care, bring it into one body, the Department for Social Care and Health, run one budget, run by one organisation. I think that will make a big difference. I think it would have come in Bevan in 48 when the NHS was there, but people didn't live long enough to need social care. I do think the Prime Minister, this one and the next one, whoever it is, needs to be bold and tackle it, because I think in the long run, it will give people quality of life and save the taxpayer money.
Yeah, I think few would disagree with that. Mike, thank you very much indeed for joining me this evening. Well, later on the show, we're going to be talking about Storm Isha. Is it as a result of climate change, or is it just what we have to accept from our weather, not least in Great Britain? I note that Scotland has been particularly harshly affected, but isn't that just a question of geography rather than a question of environmentalism? Stay tuned for that and more next.
I'm Christopher Hope.
And I'm Gloria Di Piero, bringing you
PMQ's Live here on GB News. Every Wednesday, we'll bring you live coverage of Prime Minister's questions when Rishi Sunak and Sir Keir Starmer go head-to-head in the House of Commons.
We'll be asking our viewers and listeners to submit the questions that they would like to put to the Prime Minister, and we'll put that to our panel of top politicians in our Westminster studio.
That's PMQ's Live here on GB News, Britain's election channel.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you.
GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Wake up to the headlines with headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Big news, big debates, big opinion. Patrick Christie's Tonight is the week's biggest show.
Every weekday, 9 to 11 p.m, we've got the inside track on the day's top stories. There'll be sharp takes you won't get anywhere else.
We will set the news agenda, not just follow it, and I want to bring you along for the ride.
Whatever it is, we'll have our finger on the pulse.
It's news, but it's this close to entertainment.
Patrick Christie's Tonight, 9 to 11 p.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan, Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks, the admission's free.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my two comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to Farage with me, Camilla Tominey, standing in for Nigel, who is under the weather, which is a subject we're going to discuss in just a moment. But before the break, I asked you about asylum seekers and should they be allowed to work while they wait? Let's get a few responses in. Donald says, I don't know if this is the Donald, because he could be watching, but surely this announcement only encourages yet more illegal immigrants to come to the UK, whilst at the same time we trumpet the Rwanda project as a deterrent. Madness, says Donald. Ian says, this is just another example of the government's subterfuge and deception. I'm livid. Millie says, it's absolutely wrong. The whole world will choose to come this way. Do not allow them in the first place. Another person says, it's obvious that the government has no intention of putting the immigration bill into law. This is what they intended all along. At the election, it'll be goodbye, Rishi, thanks for nothing. A damning indictment of the Prime Minister there. Well, let's talk about Storm. Is it Isha or Isha?
Isha.
Isha, thank you very much.
I want to say Isha because it looks like an eye, doesn't it?
Yes, it does a little bit. Storm Isha, as in the place down in Surrey, has been wreaking havoc across the UK. At least 3 people have died. Thousands are still without power. An amber weather warning has been issued for northern and western Scotland from 6 p.m. tomorrow until 8 a.m. on Wednesday. A rare danger to life red weather warning was in force for northern Scotland from 1 a.m. until 5 a.m. this morning, and it's not over yet because Storm Jocelyn, the second storm in 24 hours, is due to hit the UK with strong winds and heavy rain from tomorrow. Well, joining me in the studio is an expert on all things meteorological, Jim Dale, who's senior meteorologist at the British Weather Services. Jim, we often call on you to sort of talk us through what's been going on with the British weather.
Yeah. Good evening, first of all, and it's great to be in this snazzy studio.
New and
it
sparkling
really is,
studio. I'm sorry it's not Nigel, who I know you get
don't
on
worry.
with.
Yeah,
and it's
we've had conversations.
Yeah, I know you have.
I'm glad you put the under the weather because that's absolutely where he is.
Well, OK, well, let's get on to that in just a minute, because on one hand, I think you're going to say, I don't want to preempt you, that there may be climate change factors involved in these storms. And I think people watching and listening to GB News will be thinking, well, hang on a minute, you know, we'll think back to the storm of 1987.
Yeah.
With older people can think of very, very bad weather even before then. We're living in Britain. I mean, particularly if we're up in Scotland and in the Outer Hebrides, you know, the weather is very changeable, and that's just a fact of British life.
And that's normal.
Yes.
And we're in winter, so I would agree that we do get storms and we do get heat waves and we do get cold spells. The thing is, you can't look at a single storm, either one of the two storms, and say, oh, that's climate change, that's definitely it. What you've got to do is, it's a collective. You've got to look like a meteorologist. Nobody out there is necessarily going to be a meteorologist, but what I do on a daily basis is I look globally. I look at what we've got in terms of the track of weather that we've had in the UK. So if you go back a couple of years and we go back to the heat wave of July, August 2022, 40.3 degrees, there's a dot in the landscape, and before then there was other incidents going on. Now that was a huge dot because that was extreme temperatures, and then we, you know, since then, last summer, although we didn't get that kind of record, we saw months with records, various months, May and June and September and October, all-time records. So another dot, and then you're looking again globally. What's going on globally? What's going on in China, in USA, in Africa, now in Australia, for example, records falling like 9 pins. So when these storms come along, you've got to say, OK, would they have happened anyway? The answer is probably yes, they probably would have done. But when you start getting where we're up to with Jocelyn is number 10, then that's not the record. The record is 11 named storms, 2015-16. So we've been there before, but only a few years ago. So these things are starting to mount up. And do you know what? On the can of climate change, climatologists, better people than me, people who study this expertly, and they look at it and they say, OK, what we're going to get with extra dimension of heat in the atmosphere, which energy and heat that basically means that you've got more intense storms potentially that can carry more water. What do you get? You get higher wind velocities and you get more water and or snow. We've just gone through a period where parts of this country have been deluged and flooded for the first time.
Yes.
Hugely.
I mean, some places have been flooded not for the first time, and you could say that there are other environmental factors, not least the behaviour of the Environment Agency.
It's a mixture.
You speak to a lot of people who say that this kind of wilding project that's been going on in recent years and this refusal to dredge rivers, and we know of cases, don't we, of individuals who have dredged the rivers themselves and been criminalised for it. And actually, you know, if the Environment Agency is intent on leaving things as they are and saying to people who live locally, well, I'm so sorry, but you're going to be flooded, then that is going to happen. I mean, I think sometimes there's a tendency for people to talk in much more recent terms. If you look back over the sort of sands and eons of time, historically this planet has warmed up and cooled down.
That's correct.
Huge degrees.
But the difference is that we're going from the Industrial Revolution, say 150 years ago, to now. That, in terms of the time span of the Earth, is extremely small.
But do I have a point on flooding and the Environment Agency?
Yeah, you
management
do.
of floods hasn't been great, has it?
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. I don't think the Environment Agency necessarily has worked. I mean, to be honest, one of the major things that I'm not saying it's necessarily my business, but the sewage in rivers, you just carried a news story exactly on that. One of the reasons why people have a problem with that is they use these things, fishermen, swimmers, surfers, all of these people, even dog walkers, you know, you don't want to see horrible, smelly rivers and streams and seas. And so that is a huge part of it. And if the payoff is that some chief executives get huge amounts of money for allowing that to happen. And remember, there's been 2 votes on that in the House of Commons, and twice it got through in terms of allowing it to happen. So that, when it comes to the general election, will be one of the things that environmentalists, people who are concerned about the environment, whether it be lack of dredging, whether it be sewage in waters, whatever it happens to be, that will be a high-profile event come the general election in terms of an issue that will sway votes.
Also, in the terms of the kind of recording of data, if the people, the experts who are kind of looking at all of this data are seeing it through a sort of, I don't know, a prism of wanting to relate everything back to climate change, then they will. I mean, that wouldn't have been the way that people looked at weather events, say, back in 1950. Yeah,
it goes both ways, because there are people who will be looking at this programme, people who have come up against sometimes and have debates against, and in one political party particularly, who, let's just say, cherry-pick. And they'll pick things and say, well, that's not happening because of this or that. And
OK, maybe I'm
exactly the same way.
Maybe I'm cherry-picking, but we had a look back at some of the big weather events of the past, and you can point to, for instance, 2,000 people dying when the Severn Estuary flooded in 1606.
Don't
you can
remember
point
it, but
back to 8,000 people being killed by the Channel storm of 1703. You can look at wind, for instance, and you can make the calculation that the highest wind in the upper atmosphere, which was 408 miles an hour, was recorded in the Outer Hebrides in 1967.
Yeah.
The biggest tornado in the UK happened in 1666.
You've done your own work. You're very good. No, you need to join me.
I know, but at the same time, you can point to all these and say, well, we had these extraordinary weather events back in 1666.
We do, and it doesn't knock the fact you can get extraordinary weather events, and they do happen. That's planet Earth. However, and as I said to you a few minutes ago, it's about how many you get and how often you get them and the severity of them, and the way the charts are now moving in terms of let's just talk about why that is the case. And we know it's fossil fuels being released into the atmosphere. We can all go back to our school, even our junior school, and talk about the greenhouse effect and what that is, the ceiling on the atmosphere that doesn't allow heat to escape, in which case that, you know, we're into the greenhouse, and that's essentially what that's about. So it really is joining the dots and ensuring that we see that for what it is, and it is the amount of incidents and the time span that's involved, which is tiny. That is that's exactly what it is.
Jim Dale, thank you very much indeed for
You're
joining me.
welcome.
I've got a feeling with Storm Jocelyn coming, you're going to have a very busy week.
I think I'm going to have a very busy year next year as well. This year coming, we'll see.
All right, well, we'll be welcoming you back into the studio to discuss future storms, no doubt. Now, Ron DeSantis dropping out of the US presidential race. Why? And what does it mean for Donald Trump? We'll be discussing all that in just a moment. Don't go anywhere.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan, Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks, the admission's free.
Wake up to the headlines with headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Big news, big debates, big opinion. Patrick Christie's Tonight is the week's biggest show.
Every weekday, 9 to 11 p.m, we've got the inside track on the day's top stories. There'll be sharp takes you won't get anywhere else.
We will set the news agenda, not just follow it, and I want to bring you along for the ride.
Whatever it is, we'll have our finger on the pulse.
It's news, but it's this close to entertainment.
Patrick Christie's Tonight, 9 till 11 p.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you.
GB News,
Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my two comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News is Britain's news channel, and now you can support it. All you have to do is scan that QR code that's up on your screen right now, or you can go to gbnews.com/support and become a GB News member. You'll have fantastic benefits. We're also going to organise special events where you as GB News members can meet the presenters, the on-screen faces. Scan the QR code or go to gbnews.com/support. Thank you so much.
Welcome back to Farage with me, Camilla Tominey. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis will no longer be challenging Donald Trump in the race to be the Republican presidential candidate in the 2024 election.
We can't ask our supporters to volunteer their time and donate their resources if we don't have a clear path to victory. Accordingly, I am today suspending my campaign.
President Trump welcomed the news, saying he was honoured by Ron DeSantis' endorsement, and was later caught on camera saying he would officially retire the nickname Ron DeSanctimonious.
He just said, will I be using the name Ron DeSanctimonious? I said, that name is officially retired.
To be fair, Ron DeSanctimonious was a really good nickname. Joining us now, Scott Rasmussen, leading pollster, president of RMG Research, and editor-at-large at Ballotpedia, joins me. Lovely to see you. Now, what does this mean for Donald Trump? Tell us, what's the polling looking like?
Well, look, Ron DeSantis, first of all, dropped out for a very simple reason. He reads numbers well, he's data-driven, and he was absolutely right when he said there was no path forward for his campaign. And the truth is, right now, there is no path forward for anybody not named Donald Trump. In Iowa, there was this thought perhaps that there would be a group of people who liked the former president's policies but didn't like his tweeting and his other antics. But that didn't emerge. Nikki Haley is still in the race. She has big plans to pull off a surprise in New Hampshire in the primaries there. It's not. I think she's going to lose. But even if she wins in New Hampshire, the quirky nature of that primary doesn't really get her back in the game.
I mean, it is interesting to see that the more controversy he's courted, the more Donald Trump seems to have endeared himself to his fan base. Obviously, though, he does have to pull people across from the Democrats. He has to pull people across who are dissatisfied with President Biden. Maybe they're not out-and-out lefties. They may be somewhere in the middle. They went with Biden for a sense of security, and now they're fed up with the way that he's run the White House. Does that depend on the running mate for Donald Trump? Does he have to give them some red meat in some way in some policy announcements? How does he win over those people who are in the middle and are genuinely going to decide perhaps to vote for him come 2024 rather than dyed-in-the-wool Democrats?
Well, let's back up. In 2016, it was the first time in the history of polling that we had two presidential candidates who were disliked by most Americans. We thought that was very unusual. Donald Trump was elected president primarily because people were voting against Hillary Clinton. In 2020, at this time, I would have been saying Donald Trump was likely to get reelected. That's because I didn't know there was a pandemic coming that would throw 40 million Americans out of work. So we're talking about a situation where just a handful of votes can change. What's different now? 4 years ago, Joe Biden was the non-incumbent. People were unhappy with the pandemic and some other things, and he barely won. Right now, the odds are somewhat in the favor of Donald Trump, primarily because Joe Biden is more unpopular than he is.
Yes, but if you look at the numbers from when Trump first ran, and at this stage in the game, what was his support base like then compared to what it's like now, Scott?
Well, at this stage in the game, 8 years ago, we were all saying Donald Trump is not going to be the nominee. It really wasn't until he began to win those early primaries that it became clear he was going to be the nominee. So we don't have a clear gauge. Compared to where he was 4 years ago, he's a little further behind, and a lot of that has to do with the way he handled the loss in 2020. But still, the economy, what happens between now and next November is going to be decisive in terms of what happens in that election. I think the dynamic, and you hinted at it when you said, his fans seem to like it when he courts this controversy. I think that's because a lot of the people that support President Trump feel that the government is against them too. The more they attack him, the more they feel like, yes, we know how he feels. We just did a survey of the elite 1% in America. We did it with the Committee to Unleash Prosperity, and we found these people who are in policy positions, very influential, have a postgraduate degree, look down their nose at many other Americans. And the big shocking finding was that among most voters in America, they say we don't have enough individual freedom. And among this elite group, they say the people have too much freedom. When they say that, and when they challenge Donald Trump, voters are like, hey, wait a minute, something's wrong here.
Yeah, but then I'm surprised that there aren't more voters who have said, look, I did vote for Trump last time round, but the January the 6th Capitol riots was a red line for me. I can't vote for him again. I mean, is there any evidence of that? Or have people got short memories,
There
Scott?
are some, yes. Well, they do have short memories, which, unfortunately, as we age, mine gets shorter too. But when people were talking about this in the political context, there were several who said no. After January 6th, we can't. There's about 15% of voters who like Donald Trump's policies but really wish somebody else was carrying them. Yeah. Having said that, people believe Joe Biden is corrupt as well. There is not this sense that it's not that politics was pure and noble and then along came Donald Trump. Voters believe that politics has been corrupt for a very long time in our country. Sure. Most of them believe Joe Biden is less than truthful. So now you've got a choice between two people that neither one of them. Look, if you ask voters, do you want the choice to be Donald Trump versus Joe Biden? Most voters would say, no, I want another option. But that's not where we're headed.
There are no plan Bs, Scott. Very, very briefly, what is your prediction for the election?
In the primary in New Hampshire, I believe Donald Trump is going to win and go on and roll to the nomination. For the general election, if you tell me what the economy is like next November, I will tell you who wins.
Crystal balls needed. Thank you very much indeed, Scott Rasmussen, for that insider insight. Thank you. Farmers took to Westminster today to protest for fairer buying practices when it comes to selling produce to supermarkets. They used scarecrows to indicate that nearly half of fruit and veg farmers could be out of business within a year. Our reporter Christina Curtis was at the protest outside the Houses of Parliament.
Love to see British farms with British farmers on the shelves so that farmers can demonstrate that they're producing the food the way the British public wants it produced and be paid properly for that food.
These 49 scarecrows have been placed outside the Houses of Parliament today to represent the 49% of farmers who say they could lose their jobs and their livelihoods due to strict regulations in the next year. They're calling on politicians to help them out. The protest was organised by Riverford Organic Farmers, who are calling for fairer regulations when it comes to selling produce to supermarkets.
We need to have a food and farming policy for this country. We need to see farmers, treated fairly. And, let's be honest with supermarkets, they exist to make a profit for their shareholders. And if they can make that profit by paying farmers less, they will. And they have the power to be able to do this. And we need our politicians to stand up and take responsibility for, protecting farmers. The amount of food that's produced in this country and eaten in this country has fallen from 80% to the low 60s%, and that is absolutely a result of supermarkets not paying the true cost of production of that food. So we will see more farmers going out of business.
MPs debated this topic earlier today.
By empowering farmers with the tools they need to negotiate fairly, we can foster a more balanced and sustainable agricultural sector. Let us stand together in solidarity with our farmers and work towards a future where their invaluable contributions are acknowledged, respected and fairly compensated.
A British Retail Consortium spokesperson said, "Farmers play an incredibly important part in the food supply chain, and retailers will continue to source the vast majority of their food from British farmers. The strong relationships between farmers and food retailers is supported by the Groceries Supply Code of Practice, which ensures a fair partnership between the two parties." However, more than 110,000 people have now signed the hashtag #GetFairAboutFarming petition, which is pressing the government to overhaul the GSCP to make it fairer for those involved. And seeing the amount of scarecrows used to highlight the farmers that could be lost to the industry in the next year, it's clear that many need help and support to keep sustaining their produce and ensure that shelves remain stocked with locally farmed food. Christina Curtis for GB News.
Just thinking it might be an idea to send some of those scarecrows into the House of Commons. Perhaps they'd be able to get Rwanda bills through. Indeed, in the House of Lords, better than our unelected peers. But anyway, I digress. I thought I'd just have a word, actually, about the Duchess of York. Fergie, as we affectionately know her, as you probably have read, has been diagnosed now with skin cancer after undergoing breast cancer surgery back in the summer. She discovered a couple of moles. She got her dermatologist involved. The dermatologist said, we need to send these off. And she has been diagnosed with skin cancer and has put quite a moving message on her Instagram page today. And I'm sure you'll all be familiar with the fact that in the past I have covered royal affairs in various different guises, but most notably for The Telegraph. I just thought I'd say, dear old Fergie, she gets a bad press sometimes and a bad rap, but I've interviewed her on a number of occasions. I've met her on a number of occasions. At the end of the day, she is quite eccentric, as you'd expect a member of the royal family or a former member of the royal family perhaps to be. But she has got a heart of gold, and I do feel for her. I think it's really difficult, not least when we've had these health scares now from the King, who is going to, we think, undergo a procedure on his enlarged prostate this week at some point. We've also heard from the Princess of Wales having this unexpected stomach surgery, again, details to be forthcoming. And now the Duchess of York, who, let's face it, hasn't had the easiest of times. She's been there in support of the Duke of York, who, like him or loathe him, has been in the headlines for all of the wrong reasons because of his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. She's been there all the way. What was interesting, I think, when I ever did any studies into the Duchess of York is how fond the late Queen was of her. The Duke of Edinburgh, admittedly, not so much, never forgave her for the whole toe-sucking escapades of the 90s. But the Queen was always fond of her, always said that she was a great mother to Princesses Beatrice and Eugenie. So I just thought it was worth saying, sometimes you write about people and they're just the subjects of stories, but the royals are as fallible as the rest of us. They do get ill. And, of course, to have 2 cancer diagnoses in a year is pretty tough. So we send her our very best wishes. And we're going to be sticking with medical matters after the break because we're going to be talking about the measles outbreak and what can be done. So stick with us. We'll be back very soon.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I. So you want higher taxes? Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you. Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months. That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you.
GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan, Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks, the admission's free.
Big news, big debates, big opinion. Patrick Christie's Tonight is the week's biggest show.
Every weekday, 9 to 11 p.m, we've got the inside track on the day's top stories. There'll be sharp takes you won't get anywhere else.
We will set the news agenda, not just follow it, and I want to bring you along for the ride.
Whatever it is, we'll have our finger on the pulse.
It's news, but it's this close to entertainment.
Patrick Christie's Tonight, 9 to 11 p.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to Farage with me, Camilla Tominey. A bit of breaking news for you. Having discussed the notion of scarecrows doing a better job in the House of Lords than peers themselves, we discover that peers have inflicted the first defeat against Rishi Sunak's controversial Rwanda deportation plan in backing by 214 votes to 171, so that's a majority of 43, an unprecedented move seeking to delay a treaty with the East African nation that paves the way for the asylum scheme. So basically what's happened is these peers want to have a debate over the motion laid before the House by Labour Attorney General Peter Goldsmith, which basically seeks to delay the ratification of the new treaty. So they want to stall, they want to delay. Don't forget the peers can set their own timetable. So the House of Commons, MPs, they have to rush legislation through in accordance with a deadline. The Lords don't need to do that at all. So they can debate, they can prevaricate, they can delay, and there's nothing really that the government can do about it. So again, peers are unelected. You know, you elect a government to come up with a piece of legislation, it's supported in the House, it gets through, and then it gets into the upper chamber, and it could potentially be thwarted. Apparently this is democracy. We'll no doubt be inviting GB views about that during the week. Now let's discuss measles, because millions of parents in England are being urged to book their children in for missed measles, mumps and rubella, that's the MMR jabs, amid a very real risk of measles outbreaks across the country. Officials have said the decline in the uptake of routine childhood vaccination is a, quote, serious concern. Well, it certainly sounds like it. It's a serious concern, and I speak as a mother as well as a journalist in saying that. Professor Alistair Sutcliffe, Professor of General Paediatrics at UCL Great Ormond Street Institute of Child Health, joins me now. What's happened here, Professor? Because I initially saw this story and I thought, is this the Andrew Norfolk effect? You know, people being put off giving their children MMR jabs. But actually, it seems to me that those children will be grown up by now, and this is affecting younger people. Therefore, are there some that are just not taking up these vaccinations at birth, regardless of any concerns that may have been raised in the past about the jab?
Yes, I think that's possible. I mean, what's planned here is, sadly, 2016, Britain declared itself measles-free, and it's crept back with the fall in the rates of vaccination. So Optimal would be 95% or above, and we're only at sort of 84%. So, and then there's outbreaks, a major regional one in the Birmingham area with 50 children last month seen by colleagues in Birmingham Children's Hospital.
Is there any sort of demographic evidence that that's a cultural thing, or, I mean, why Birmingham? Why central London?
I'd be reticent to say that it's in a city where things spread much quicker.
OK, makes sense.
Yeah.
But then I can't quite understand it from a parental perspective, because I remember with all my three, you had your little red book, you had to go and see your health visitor, get them weighed, make sure that breastfeeding or bottle feeding is going all right, and then the vaccinations. I mean, I suppose there was a choice, but there wasn't really. I mean, understandably and rightly, in my view, as
it's a public
daughter of a
health
doctor,
matter.
it's a public health matter. You got your children vaccinated. Why are people now thinking it's a sort of choice?
I think it's just that it's the society we live in. There's been some pushback. There's anti-vaccine all the time going along ever since vaccines were invented.
What, do you think there's a COVID effect then, that people have got less faith in vaccines per se?
Possibly. Personal child health record, as you referred to it, the Red Book, still exists.
Yes.
And you're supposed to get your stamps, you go and get your vaccines. Crazy not to, frankly, but on the other hand, that's the situation. So we have to have a big catch-up. There's at least 1 million individuals who've not been vaccinated.
Wow. And Prof, let's talk about the seriousness of what happens when you get measles. I mean, you can go deaf. It is a terrible thing to suffer from. Just talk us through it so we can urge people. If anyone's watching or listening to this, they haven't been vaccinated or haven't got their children vaccinated, for goodness sake, go to the hospital because...
Well, 30% complication rate. You can get pneumonia. You can get ear infections from it. If you're less lucky, you can get the dreaded encephalitis.
Yes.
You can have seizures. You can die from measles. And even if you don't get those things, you're at risk of a complication, which I've practiced, especially for the show, subacute sclerosing panencephalitis. No, I'm just joking.
Don't test me on that. Don't make me spell it.
SSPE, and that happens about 7 years after you've had it, and it's basically a terrible death.
OK,
so I mean, it's not, it's no shit Sherlock that you should get vaccinated.
I'll have to apologise for your language there, Prof. But fair enough, you clearly feel strongly about it. And the MMR, you know, it's a safe jab. So people must administer
absolutely. It's not 100% safe, but no vaccine on the planet is. But it's that exchange, and the reality is it's highly protective, 99% or above if you go through the programme.
Thank you very much indeed for joining us,
All
Professor.
Righty. Thank you.
Jacob Rees-Mogg, father of 6. I bet they're all vaccinated, aren't they?
They are all vaccinated, yes.
Good man.
Yes, of course they are.
Of course they are. What am I even asking?
Of course they are. I mean, I think it is very important. But I also think it's important that politicians say that their children are vaccinated.
Very good point.
Because it's no good politicians telling other people to do things if they haven't done themselves and they've had the MMR jab, all of them.
What's on your show tonight?
What's on my show? My programme. I get in terrible trouble with my mother if I call it a show. She thinks that sounds... Anyway.
What's on your programme?
On my programme, first of all, I'm going to be talking about tartar steel. And why our crazy green regulations are closing down our industry. Our energy, our electricity is 75% more expensive than in the United States. I'm then going to be talking to 3 people whose family are hostages in Gaza, and we mustn't forget about them. It's moved out of the news, but they're going to be coming in, and I'm going to talk to them about what's happening and hoping that Qatar may be able to help.
Yes. Well, that sounds very interesting and compelling stuff. Jacob, thank you very much. Stay tuned for that. Let's put our fingers together and hope that Nigel is better very, very soon. State of the Nation next, but first, here's the weather.
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Evening. Storm Jocelyn will be arriving this time tomorrow on Tuesday evening. Not as intense as Storm Isha, but nevertheless could cause some further disruption. Brewing out in the Atlantic at the moment. There is the next storm system. Storm Isha continues to clear away. Still plenty of isobars on the chart. It is still pretty gusty out there this evening. Plenty of showers too, packing in across Scotland in particular. But the showers will tend to ease off in most places, generally becoming clear overnight, and the winds will ease down further until the cloud thickens and we start to see wet weather coming into Northern Ireland by dawn. With the clearer skies and as the winds ease, we could see some pockets of frost across Scotland, but for most of us, we'll start Tuesday at 4 or 5 degrees. Many in the east will start dry and bright, but the rain will spread into the west
and then become pretty much across all parts by lunchtime. The heaviest rain, though, over Western Hills. The rain could cause some disruption because after Storm Isha, where we had quite a bit of rain falling, extra rainfall may cause some flooding issues, and then the winds continue to strengthen. Actually quite a mild day tomorrow, but not feeling all that mild with the wind and the rain. And the winds continue to strengthen during Tuesday evening, particularly across the north. The winds won't be as strong as with Storm Isha, but because Storm Isha has only just cleared, it could have caused some structural issues. So we do have warnings in place, a broad yellow warning, gusts of 55 to 65 miles an hour, and the amber warning across northern and western Scotland, where gusts could touch 80 miles an hour.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's Newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's Newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Have a great Saturday night with me, Leo Curse, on the Saturday Night Showdown. It's a crazy world out there, so come and make fun of it with me, my panel of comedians, and a couple of people who actually know what they're talking about. This Saturday Night Showdown is your front row ticket to the clown show every Saturday, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan, Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks, the admission's free.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
Delicious.
mental?
Open your mouth. OK, here comes a train.
Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa! Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you.
GB News,
Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my two comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Wake up to the headlines with headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to